and I'm going to be chairing today's session. So on to the next slide. So just a little bit of an introduction and a welcome. So first of all, why are we here? So as I'm sure you all know, all charities, irrelevant of their size, are impacted by the cost of living crisis. The challenges facing the sector are highlighted by Wave 1, covering November 2022, of the Voluntary Sector Barometer. So the Voluntary Sector Barometer is a partnership project between Nottingham Trent University, Sheffield Hallam, NCVO, UK Economic Social Research Council, and Probo Economics. And it basically looks at the state of the sector. So prices for nearly everything we buy have gone up, especially energy. So the Voluntary Sector Barometer has shown us that 69% of respondents to the barometer reported a deteriorated financial position and a 50% median energy cost increase. The demand for support has substantially increased. So increasing demands for services is the second most important concern for respondents to the barometer. And many charities are having to change the way they operate and seriously consider how and if they can prepare for the difficult months ahead. So we've seen that 10% of respondents to the barometer had reduced the level or number of services offered. So whilst grant making and foundations are not the sole solution to this crisis, they do have an important role to play. They can think about their approach to funding through the crisis and also advocate to government for sector support. So with this in mind, the aim of today's session is really to give you a sense of what funders are thinking and doing in response to the cost of living crisis, and also to provide you with some tips on how you can work effectively with your funders in the coming months. We do really want to hear from you about your experience with funders to date and how you think funders can help. So in terms of who we have with us today, so we have Francesca De Munich, Interim Head of Policy at the Association of Charitable Foundations, Helen Matty, Director of Partnerships and Place at London Funders, and Joe Dobson, Head of Region for Yorkshire and Humber at the National Lottery Community Fund. So just a little bit in terms of the agenda. So we're doing a bit of a welcome, housekeeping and introduction, and then we will swiftly move on to hear from Francesca, who's going to talk about the Association of Charitable Foundations, who they are, and what they're hearing from their members. And then we're also going to then hear from Helen and Joe with regards to what the response has been from London Funders and the National Lottery Community Foundation, but also some top tips from them in terms of how you can work effectively, more generally, with your funders. And then there will be time for question and answer. And we are aiming to kind of wrap up and finish by 1:30. So we'll do a bit of signposting at the end. So just a little bit about us, about NCVO, for any of you who aren't aware of us. So we are the largest network for charities and volunteering. We're proud to represent and support over 17,000 voluntary organisations of all sizes. So from the very biggest household name charities, right down to the kind of smallest community groups. Our members range from the kind of big medical research charities to the kind of local amateur sports clubs. And at their heart, they all have the aim of making the world around them a better place. So this shared aim links directly, obviously, with NCVO's vision, which is a society where we can all make a difference to the causes that we believe in. So moving on to the next slide. So this is just some really kind of general housekeeping stuff. So you'll hopefully have noticed that closed captions or subtitles have been enabled. You can turn these on and off by clicking the CC icon in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. We'll also share the PowerPoint slide deck for today in the chat, so that will be done. If it would help with accessibility, you can obviously download the PowerPoint slides to your computer so that you can zoom in and out of the slides as we move through them. Just in terms of some other housekeeping matters, so yeah, we are going to be running straight through to 1:30, so there won't be a break. If you have a question, I can see someone has a hand raised. If you can post any questions using the Q&A function, and any kind of comments or reflections, please do put in the chat box. So yeah, if you can kind of distinguish between those, so questions go in the Q&A function and comments and reflections go in the chat. So microphones are muted automatically and your video camera is obviously turned off. From our perspective, we're not anticipating any fire alarms, but obviously do keep an ear out for where you are. And finally, please do respect confidentiality just in terms of what others are sharing. And then the final thing actually to say is that obviously today's session is being recorded and that by being here, you acknowledge this. We are planning to send the recording to those who registered for the webinar today, but it will also be put on NCVO's YouTube channel and also on our cost of living page. So we thought we'd do a bit of a poll just to get everyone started. So the poll is, how do you feel about your funders' response to the cost of living crisis so far? So we'll just wait a minute. I'm going to stay quiet while people have a bit of a think about this, and then we'll come back once it looks like most people have responded. Great. Okay, so I think we can show the results. So it looks like the majority of people, which is encouraging, so 42% are quite encouraged. So that's the good news. However, only 3% are very encouraged. And then there is a kind of quite significant proportion who are kind of not very encouraged, so 29%. So hopefully by the end of this, you might hopefully feel more confident to improve your answers to those questions. And also, yeah, you'll obviously get the chance to hear from London funders and the National Lottery Community Fund in terms of what they're doing. So that hopefully will give you a bit of confidence too. But anyway, let's move on. I'm going to hand over now to Francesca.
Thank you, Josie, and really interesting to see that opening poll and great to see so many charities on the call as well. Really looking forward to the discussion later. So if we could move on to the next slide, please.
Sorry, technical issue. The polling seems to have slightly jarred my ability to control the slides. So
okay.
Miriam is able to do it from her end.
Just give me one moment. If you try stopping sharing and then try again. And then see if you can share again.
Great, thank you everyone. So yes, I'm Francesca. I'm interim head of policy at the Association of Charitable Foundations, the ACF. And it's great to be here today as part of this joint webinar between ACF and NCVO. We've got two fantastic speakers lined up, so I'm not going to say too much today, but I did want to give an overview of who ACF is and what we're hearing from our members. So ACF is the membership body for UK foundations and grant-making charities, and we've got over 440 members now from the funding sector, and our membership continues to grow. ACF exists to support foundations to be ambitious and effective in the way that they use their resources, and that's obviously particularly important at the moment, given the current cost of living crisis that we're all experiencing. We have set up a dedicated cost of living resources page on the ACF website, and that will be shared towards the end of this presentation. And that's really aimed at providing resources to help our members and broader trusts and foundations to navigate the crisis and consider how they can best support charities like yourselves and the communities that they serve. Can I have the next slide, please? So just to give you a bit of a snapshot of what we're hearing from members, our members continue to think about how they can best support charities and communities and also deliver on their missions. And when we've spoken to members, many are experiencing rising costs themselves and reduced investment returns, which does mean a squeeze on those programme budgets. But many of our members have been telling us that they're really committed to maintaining support to grantees and to achieve objectives over the coming years, with the flexibility to spend more during times of great need that we're experiencing right now. And we've spoken to members at various member networks that we run, learning events, and we also did an in-depth piece last month for Charity Finance magazine, so do take a look at that as well. To give you a bit of an overview though of what we're hearing, what are the key emerging themes from funders, I'll talk through those kind of themes on the slide. So firstly, foundations that can increase their giving are doing this to take account of rising costs and rising need. And some of our members are adjusting the funding they provide to avoid a real terms fall in the value of grants. So that's sometimes by providing uplifts for things like spiraling energy bills and increased costs more generally. And some foundations are particularly planning an uplift focused on smaller charities. And I know Helen's going to talk in a bit more detail about what London funders are hearing on uplifts too. We're also hearing from members about hardship funds, emergency funding, and other financial assistance. And that's particularly as charities adjust to meet new and growing needs. And we've heard some examples of the provision of warm community spaces, particularly over the tough winter months. Foundations have also been making a shift in some cases towards offering unrestricted or full cost recovery grants, so to cover all the costs involved in running a project, to help organisations better manage the impacts of inflation. And it really helps with that longer term security as well, as this crisis seems to be persisting. Others are also encouraging grantees to use their funds flexibly, such as shortening the length of the grant and bringing spend forward to help address that urgent need. Many grant makers are also now distinguishing between the grants that they've already awarded, which won't necessarily have predicted or taken into account the cost of living increases compared to new funding applications. So some are now asking for those new applications to factor in inflation and rising costs as part of efforts to future-proof their long-term sustainability. ACF members have also spoken of the importance of that relational approach, so being open and responsive and prioritising open communication and knowledge sharing, particularly at moments like this, critical moments of change. Many foundations are encouraging grant holders to share the challenges they're experiencing. For instance, we're hearing examples of charities who support groups that have typically higher energy needs, such as disabled people and people on low incomes. So they are communicating to funders that energy costs are a greater proportion of their spending, and therefore that additional support is required. And we've also heard of some funders who are engaging with wider stakeholders, so not just current grant holders, but also potential grantees, to understand their concerns and needs. And this includes being clear about grant-making processes, so what funders are doing and they can't do, and providing really clear and robust guidance to those thinking about applying in the future. Some are considering collaboration as a way to make their funding go further. That's something at ACF we really try to support. We run the Funders Collaborative Hub, and you can find more information about that online. And then finally, even though foundations are grappling with increased demand, many are also thinking beyond the current crisis, which I know many charities on this call will be thinking about as well. So how do you balance immediate need with the kind of longer term challenges? And one of the advantages of endowed foundations, which make up many of our members, is that they can look at how grants and investments have developed over the past decade, so not just the past 12 months. So how can these funders think about the long term, and often recognizing that the rising cost of living is exacerbating deep-rooted issues for many communities, so not losing sight of those longer term challenges. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Hopefully this doesn't cause too many technical issues. We've got our second poll of today. So what support from funders have you been offered? So thinking about some of the themes I talked through a minute ago, have you been offered any of these? So emergency funding for specific new activity, unrestricted funding, an uplift in current or future grants in line with inflation. And if there's anything else, then feel free to put that in the chat. I'll just give you a minute to respond. And if we could have the results of the poll.
Just a few people still answering. I'll share it in a moment.
Thank you. And great to see some other answers come through in the chat as well.
Yeah, I think that's most people.
Great, thank you, Miriam. Okay, so the number one answer here is nothing, which is obviously a concern. We also have an uplift in current future grants in line with inflation, coming out fairly strongly, unrestricted funding and emergency funding as well. And then there's also some other answers in the chat. So really interesting to see, clearly a mixed picture, but also quite a chunk of you saying that you've not had any specific support from funders during this cost of living crisis. Thank you. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, hopefully that works.
So I'm going to come out, bear with us, I'm going to come out and reshare because the polling doesn't like it.
Thank you, Helen.
There we go, that should be okay.
Thanks very much, Helen. Great, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the advocacy work that ACF is doing and other organisations in the sector. So really, it's clear that funders are playing an important role. Obviously, there's quite a mixed response in terms of the poll we've just had, but for some charities, they are receiving additional support during cost of living crisis, but also that funders can't plug all the gaps. And that's really what we're hearing strongly from our members, from the wider sector as well. And we know that the scale of the challenge is absolutely huge across the country and not one that foundations on their own can address. And we really want government to do more to act at the scale that's needed. Some of you might have seen there was a new State of the Social Sector survey recently by Pro Bono Economics and Nottingham Business School, which surveyed hundreds of charities about how they were experiencing the current crisis. It's a really devastating read. I wanted to pull out some statistics, which I'm sure won't be a surprise to many of you on the call. But 1 in 5 charities report that they have reduced their use of premises as a result of energy costs, and just under 1 in 10 have reduced their hours of operation. And one charity even reported that its staff are working with the lights turned off. So clearly this is an ongoing crisis for many organisations, despite the energy support that we have seen. So that's why ACF has joined forces with other infrastructure bodies, including NCVO, to call for further support. As many of you might be aware, the government recently announced a new energy support scheme called the Energy Bill Discount Scheme, and this is ahead of the current scheme ending in March. And NCVO are going to do a separate webinar on this in more detail. But just to note now that obviously it's great to see charities have been included in support beyond March and to see them acknowledged in government's thinking. But the level of support that is going to be introduced is much reduced compared to the initial support that we've seen during the earlier part of this crisis. So ACF and others are going to continue to work to advocate for further support and really understand what the scheme offers and where the gaps are for the sector. So that's something that we'll continue to do. And that's all from me. I will pass over to Helen now.
Thanks, Francesca. Hi, everybody. I'm going to move forward. So it doesn't seem to like me, this slide deck, so I'm going to stop and come back. Bear with me. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so yeah, good to be here. Thanks for inviting us to join this webinar. I work at London Funders. If you don't know us, we are a cross-sector network of funders working in the capital, as the name suggests. But amongst our membership are lots of national funders as well. So from the people like the lottery, other national funders, down to very, very local, kind of hyper-local funders. So it's quite a diverse member base. So I'm going to talk today and draw on some of the insights and the evidence that's come through our networks over the last couple of months. So although it's, you know, it's from our London membership, given, you know, a lot of our kind of work across the country, hopefully it's fairly representative of the wider funding community. So I guess that's the kind of context to bear in mind. As an organisation, Francesca mentioned collaboration. We're also all about collaboration, bringing funders together to try and connect them, look at how we can work better together, sharing insights about what communities need so that funding can be more effective. So obviously the cost of living crisis has been high on the agenda of a lot of our members over the last few months. And we've been, really trying to work with them to think about how to respond, sharing ideas from others about, what things can be put in place to mitigate some of those risks that are facing organisations. So I'll talk a bit about what we've heard from our members, but as Josie referred to at the start, really interested to hear how this resonates with what you've experienced from working with your funders as well. So hopefully we can share some of that towards the end of the webinar. So this first slide, none of this I'm sure is going to be a surprise, but I've included it because I think it's probably helpful to still see that funders, the challenges that are on funders' radars. So we did a survey back in end of August, September, and we had responses from our membership, and we asked them, what they're seeing already. So I imagine, this is kind of ramped up since then. All the things that I'm sure are being experienced by yourselves, increased costs, but also things like staff burnout, the recruitment challenges that have come alongside the cost of living crisis, fewer volunteers, the changes in service delivery that organisations are having to grapple with as well. And some of those quotes I've put on there because I think, there is real concern about the organisations that funders are supporting. And I think, a really keen awareness about what's needed to try and support organisations through this period and ongoing. I think we all know it's not going to go away soon. One thing I was particularly going to draw attention to actually was this issue of the kind of staff and organisational well-being of their grantees. So yes, it's, the service delivery is really, really challenging, but a lot are also thinking about how they can do more to support, the staff well-being, that kind of last quote there, protecting, the ability of their grantees to do the job that they want to do. So we might come back to that a bit later, but that came through really strongly in the survey that we did in the summer. In terms of what this means for their kind of funding requests and applications that they're getting, you'll see, nearly half have had an increase in the number of applications since the kind of cost of living pressures really kicked in. Some areas in particular there's higher demand for, so youth provision, debt support around debt, financial support and food were areas that have been particularly highlighted. Requests for larger grants, core and unrestricted, again, probably not a surprise. And that kind of sense of urgency from organisations and applicants needing support for that kind of immediate sort of short-term ability to be able to keep providing their services. And I think, again, that comes through in those quotes. There's that kind of urgency to requests, and I think funders have been thinking about how they balance that, you know, need for very short-term support to kind of weather this sort of the initial bit of the crisis, but also what that means for some of the longer term kind of sustainability of some of those organisations. There was also that one of the quotes in the middle there on the slide, a sense that, you know, some funders, as you'll know, do have criteria, although some are trying to be more flexible. Some do have quite set criteria for some of their programmes, and there was a sense of organisations really trying to somehow, in some way, try and fit some of their projects into that, where potentially it might not be appropriate. So we'll also come back to that a bit later on in terms of how to try and get around and look at where your programmes can best fit. But what are funders doing? So it was really interesting to see the poll a few minutes ago, and encouraging in some ways, but also clear that there's a lot more that funders could be doing in this space. So in September, when we did the survey that I mentioned, we asked funders then what steps they're taking. You might not be able to see all of the labels on this graph, but I'll run through a couple of them quickly. Uplifts, we've mentioned, Francesca mentioned uplifts to current and multi-year grants that applicants have. So yeah, you'll see there sort of 13% and 19% already thinking about uplifts to current one-year grants, and a further 24% who are planning to do so on multi-year grants, and a slightly smaller proportion, 13%, already doing so. A lot higher proportion are thinking about that flexibility. So how can they offer increased flexibility in terms of the delivery of some of the grant agreements that they've got with groups? So that might be flexing timescales or the type of delivery that's been offered, re-looking at some of the maybe outcomes that had previously been agreed. So just trying to look at things and provide that flexibility for groups. Some funders are creating additional funding pots, as Francesca talked about as well. Looking also at funds for individuals. So looking at maybe, you know, instead of providing, or as well as providing grants to frontline organisations, we have seen more funders providing grants to individuals. And again, some of those are the changes, looking at flexing and making changes to application processes to make it easier, try and reduce the burden for frontline groups to apply. So yeah, you'll see hopefully some of the things that funders have been doing already and kind of thinking about trying to implement. And yeah, as I said, I'd be very interested to hear if any of these kind of resonate, or you've been offered that response from the funders that you're working with. I've mentioned uplifts. So I was just going to talk a little bit more about uplifts, because it's been, I guess, one of the key responses that people have been looking at. And obviously funders are very, very different. Some are, I guess, more able to look at uplifts depending on the size of their grant pot, whether they're delivering funds on behalf of another donor, for example. So there might be restrictions that make it difficult, but I would say, you know, we've heard quite a lot about uplifts, and we've tried to gather a few examples of what that looks like in practice. So again, not all funders are doing this, but where they are, we've seen quite different responses, which range from a kind of one-off fixed payment. So instead of a percentage uplift on a grant, it's been a kind of one-off fixed payment to help grantees with the extra costs. Others have done an uplift on the kind of outstanding remainder of a grant that's in place, usually about 10%, but we have heard of funders doing this up to 20%. It kind of depends. Some are doing these uplifts for this financial year only, and others are looking at kind of periods beyond this and multi-year grants. And others, you know, it's being done very much on a case-by-case basis, depending on the needs of the group, and the funders, ability to repurpose some of their funding. So I'll leave those quotes up there to look at. I will just draw attention to the last quote on there, just because Francesca brought this up as well about new applicants. So as well as uplifts, I think we also heard a lot from our members that as funders, they need to be better at asking people and applicants to tell them about kind of inflationary increases as well, because, you know, we've got used to it being quite low. So actually, you know, constructively challenge and say, is this enough? You know, make sure that they're asking the questions back to applicants to make sure that it's accurately reflected in their applications. So what other steps are funders taking? I guess beyond kind of uplifts, so collaboration, we've talked about. A lot of funders are getting involved in cross-sector groups and alliances locally, working on joint appeals, for example. So obviously that's really good to see. A lot of that's kind of cross-sector. I mentioned Cash First and grants to individuals. Some have said they're doing this for the first time, or they're putting more money into grants for individuals, often for the very basic things like food and fuel bills. And others reviewing their funding programs and medium-term strategies. So thinking, given the cost of living, is there a different way or better way that they can direct some of their funding? So yeah, a couple of quotes up there as well. In terms of that kind of longer term thinking, we did also ask about what they think it will mean for some of those changes a bit further down the line. So some are thinking of increasing their grant making, some are looking at drawing down more of their endowment if they're an endowed funder, changing the types of activity they're funding. I think, as Francesca referred to, you know, funders are in different positions, I think, because of other kind of economic pressures as well. And just, I think, taking this as an opportunity to kind of review what they might do on that kind of longer term basis going forward. So something that we're kind of keen to keep an eye on as we go forward. Right, we've got another poll. So Miriam will launch this in a second. So we've talked a bit about some of the support from funders. So we'd be really interested, what would you find most helpful going forward? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. And Miriam, if you just share the results when people have filled it in, that would be great.
Just a few more people answering the question and then we'll share.
Great, thank you. Okay, so quite a clear front runner. Unrestricted funding would be the thing that you would find most helpful going forward. Slightly a lower percentage on opportunities to connect with funders. Uplifts, so actually 16% said uplifts for current and future grants. And a small percentage also in terms of emergency funding for specific and new activity. So thank you, that's really useful to see. And I think unrestricted funding is probably the thing that we hear most about in terms when, you know, talking to community groups. And I'm going to move on very quickly to, I guess, the desire to push that anyway. You know, the cost of living, I think, has highlighted the need for some of that funding to be less restrictive, and it's certainly something a lot of our members are looking if they're not already doing. Right, I suspect I'm going to have to, apologies, stop sharing and reshare. There we go. Let's see if it will. Okay, hopefully that's all right for everybody. So the final few slides from me. I guess we've been sort of thinking how we can take the lessons from COVID, really. You know, the pandemic created, as you all know, huge amount of urgent short-term need, kind of unanticipated pressures. And I think from funders, or a lot of funders, saw quite a different response. So thinking about other ways of working that could get money out quickly to groups. Some of the things that people have said just in the poll there, you know, the need for more flexibility, less restrictive funding. A lot of those things we saw in the pandemic, and I think we're really keen to kind of learn from those lessons and think how we build on that, not just through the cost of living, but beyond as well. So I've just put a few things on here that are, you know, common things that we're talking about within our networks, and I'm sure within others as well. There's a kind of movement, the open and trusting grant making movement, which is all about sort of trusters making commitments to be more open and trusting in the way they work with community groups. And you may well have come across it yourselves. And really, you know, this is something that is not just about how we work in a time of crisis. It's kind of how we can work, you know, at all times. So I think we're really keen to kind of embrace those commitments and think about how we can support different funders to implement those as we go forward. But there's lots in there about being flexible, about being proportionate to the amount of information that's requested, about how to have those kind of honest relationships with your funder, which hopefully, you know, will address some of the challenges that are now becoming more pronounced with cost of living. Equity-led approaches to funding, so prioritising groups that are led by the communities that they're working for. There's some really good kind of equity-led funding programs specifically at the moment. So again, thinking about how we improve how we're working in that space. There's lots of links, I'm sure they might be on the stuff that Josie's sharing, but if not, lots on our website around what's happened and some case studies about that. Utilising local infrastructure, how can funders work again locally with statutory partners, with voluntary sector, and with alliances. A lot of that's been reactivated, I think, with cost of living crisis, and we're seeing some really good collaborations, particularly at a local level. We've seen funders, particularly larger national funders, work with smaller local funders to distribute money. That happened in the pandemic, and it's also happened with the cost of living. Because often these small local funders have the links, have the knowledge, have those roots into very small grassroots groups, which, you know, it can be more difficult for other funders. So we're seeing some, really good joint working, like with place-based giving schemes or hyperlocal funders. And again, to kind of hammer this message, I know it's been said already, but how we balance the need for short-term funding with longer-term programs, because we've kind of been moving from crisis to crisis, but the long-term structural challenges that are there haven't gone away and are, you know, kind of exacerbated, I suppose. So yeah, how do we get the funding right for that? So final slide, and I apologise, I slightly went over. What else can the funding world do? And interested in your thoughts when we move into the Q&A. I've talked about collaboration and we've talked about advocacy, but I'll come back to that point which Francesca made, because I think, the advocacy power of funders, how can we use our voice more, to contribute to some of the policy debate that's going on. That need to be strategic, so we don't lose sight of the need for that longer term change. Being flexible and trusting, so the open and trusting grant makers is particularly worth having a look at. And also some very tangible things, you know, becoming living wage employers and grant makers. So, you know, as a community of funders, there are some things that we can do to try and support groups and make sure we can try and address some of the challenges which are being much more pronounced in the current climate. So I shall leave it there, and I think pass over to Joe.
Thank you very much. So hello everybody. I'm going to try and sort of run through mine quickly, because I think often there's more value in questions than reading through sort of my slides. They're going to be there for posterity for what they're worth. I'm just going to be talking mainly initially about the National Lottery Community Fund, and then also looking at some sort of more specific micro tips or advice in relation to working with funders. But I would reiterate what Helen said, is that all funders are different, so it's quite difficult to give generic advice. If you could go to the next slide. It's always useful to know who you're sort of talking to, or if you like. I've only worked for a funder for about a year, and prior to that, always or worked as a fundraiser, working directly for charities, small ones and big ones. So some of the time when I speak at these things, I end up using we as if I'm talking about fundraisers or charities, as distinct from actually a funder. So I'll try and avoid that. And yeah, I've done lots of other things. I try and have a competition with people for who's had a more varied career. Some would say can't stick at things. Some would say that's an interesting portfolio career. If anyone wishes to actually ask anything in relation to the fund, you're more than welcome to contact me directly. Email address is there. So if you go to the next slide, prior to actually starting, this is something for the chat. Sometimes you have to sort of justify your attendance. Why are you spending 2 hours on a webinar? So 2 small prizes, genuine, this is a real thing for individual charities. If on the chat you can share, and there is a correct answer to each of these questions. What is the best type of crisp, and what is the best Billy Joel song? And there is actually a sort of answer which will be relevant to when I get to the end. Again, email address will be on, I saw there was a question, email address will be on the slides, which will be shared. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So what is our approach as a fund to cost of living? I'm not going to go through all of this. There again is a link there that you'll be able to click through when you receive the slides. And that actually gives you a sort of blog and a link to what we are trying to do. But the headlines are, one, we're simply keeping all our funding open and available. I know that some funders post, in inverted commas, COVID, not really post, but post-COVID have chosen to sort of renew their strategy at this time. And that's exactly what we're doing as a fund. We're going through that process at the moment, but we haven't closed any of our funding programs. We're remaining open for business. And we estimate that on top of what we're ordinarily distributing, that there will be around £75 million that will be distributed, specific, if you like, to cost of living, but not with a particular fund. So some with partnerships with other funders that are developing their own funds around cost of living, some around uplifts, variations, etc. Some grants which aren't for a particular cost of living funding stream, but people applying to us for projects specifically working on cost of living. So that's where that 75 million comes from. We aim to be flexible and adaptable. Come to uplifts and variations later, but you know, anyone who's a grant holder with us, certainly on reaching communities and on partnerships, you know, have the capacity to talk to us in relation to how cost of living is affecting them. We want to, I guess, we're commitment to sort of people and communities remains the same, i.e. you tell us what cost of living means to you in terms of when you're coming to us for projects or uplifts. And finally, through working with different partners, including London Funders, ACF, we'll try and work with others and analyse the funding we're giving to try and make sure what we're doing is as effective as possible for charities and for the communities ultimately that we're all trying to help. So if we can go on to the next slide. So the general approach to working with existing funders, I know I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs here, but so it's the basic stuff that really we again, I'm using that term again, but do as fundraisers, as charities. Firstly, really work out what is it that your community needs and you need before you go and talk to your funder. So how has it, you know, how cost of living has genuinely affected your organisation, the people you work with, and that may mean sometimes internally looking at salaries, energy costs, etc., and it may mean demand. What demand change do you see in terms of the people you're working with, and find out the funder's policy position before you approach them. Again, I know it's basic, but it's amazing how often people don't do that. Most organisations will have things on their website, pick up the phone, talk to people. I put a little pink asterisk. Obviously, some funders will say, you sort of can't talk to us before you apply, etc. So there are sort of provisos to that. But in general, you know, most funders will want to engage. And usually the thing that holds us back when it happens sometimes is simply capacity and having enough staff time to do that. So that's the challenge. But in principle, I know, you know, 95% of funders will want to talk and have that relationship. And one of the key questions is also about how cost of living is likely to affect you in the medium and long term, particularly if you're engaging in a conversation with a funder, not just about now, but about 3 years, 5 years. So if we go on to the next slide. At the same time, while we have to look forward, medium and long term, you aren't Mystic Meg. When, you know, funders aren't expecting you to sort of look 10 years in advance to know exactly what's going to happen. And the flip side of not really thinking forward from perspective of a funder, or when people approach me, if they haven't really thought about you know, what it is they're asking for, how they want to work with us. Sometimes they'll say, well, you know, the cost of living crisis is going to go on for the next decade, and this is going to happen, this is going to happen. Actually, it's impossible to tell. Really, the government doesn't know. I don't know what's happened with employment rates, with inflation, etc. So try and be realistic, I would say, when approaching funders in terms of what are the knowns and what are the unknowns. So we go to the next slide, please. So specific in relation to uplifts and variations, and I would repeat again what I was saying and what Helen said, that all funders are different. Firstly, demonstrating demand. I noticed in the chat there that Matt and Anna had commented that, you know, why should funders expect evidence of need when there clearly is you know, there is a cost of living crisis which is affecting communities across the country, and I think that's a valid question. And I don't think funders should be expecting you to go out and, in my view, to do a micro analysis of the economic situation of your neighbourhood. However, it's perfectly reasonable, I think, for a funder to say, well, you say there's increased demand. Does that mean you've actually had more people using your service, or this is something you're anticipating? Is this something you would like to do, but you don't have the capacity to do it at the moment? Are referrals going up, or waiting lists going up? So from my perspective, funders, particularly those that are responsible for public funds, have to clearly demonstrate, you know, our reasoning and our logic for making awards. So you can demonstrate, you can evidence that without, hopefully, funders asking for an unreasonable amount of information. So just think, what can you demonstrate from what you're seeing day to day? What numbers are using? What are people you're working with telling you? You may also be asked by funders, and I know we as the fund will ask if people come to us, what are your alternative approaches? So could you be asked about different ways of delivery, different referral processes, partnership working arrangements? Is there someone next door that has capacity that actually could take on some of that for you without an uplift? That sort of thing. Just thinking about what other approaches there might be, which I think Helen also touched upon, but potentially Francesca as well, with the sort of partnerships and how you're working locally with collaborations. Are you underspent? Had quite a few people coming to our team who are really underspent, going, can we have an uplift? And we will say, you haven't spent £50,000, but you're asking for a £50,000 uplift. I mean, I'm using that as an example, but you know, think about your current grant spend performance, if you like, with any funder you're approaching. Staffing salaries, funders, and certainly, again, speaking for the fund directly, may consider alternatives to more traditional requests for inflationary pay rises, so about one-off payments. And also funders may be reluctant to fund consecutive pay rises if you've got a 5-year grant. well, we can be fairly confident for the next 2 years there's likely to be increased inflation, but for years 3, 4 or 5, no, we probably wouldn't commit to continuing increases in your grant amount. So again, you just have to be, I think, realistic. And one of the key questions is, how will that affect your wider pay structure as an organisation? How, if the lottery fund, as an example, that we are saying, okay, we will agree to increase the salary of your staff by 5% this year, another 5% next year. What about those posts that aren't funded by us? Is that going to cause issues for you? So that's something quite important to think about. Loss of match funding. So some funders, if we're funding 50% of the project and there's match funding supporting the other 50%, potentially not from a grant funder, maybe from a major donor who's decided to pull out as a result of cost of living or this business no longer having the income they'd expected, then that's something else. Some funders, and I know that the lottery, again, we will consider that as an impact of cost of living. Again, not all funders will do that, but that's something to think about. And finally, a key thing, and again, this is something specific to the fund, but is about, to come to uplifts, looking at uplifts of our own project as a funder versus other people's funded projects. So if we as the National Lottery Community Fund are 100% or 50% for that matter funding a particular project, someone comes to us and says, right, we'd like you to fund uplifts on this, and we'd also like you to fund effectively an uplift on something else that we don't even fund in the first place. And that's something that's happened quite a lot. And I do appreciate, having done project management in the voluntary sector for a long time, that often when you're working on the coalface, so to speak, you just sort of perceive the work you do to be specific, not specific to a funder almost. It's like, this is the work we do, we're supporting these communities. But, you know, we can't contractually give an uplift for something that we don't already fund. That wouldn't be an uplift, that would be a new grant. So, you know, try to be quite clear about what it is you're asking for from who. Yeah, so next slide, please. And I'm trying to go through this very quickly in order that there are more questions. So this is a picture of Billy Joel, as you can tell. The actual correct answer to the crisps question, by the way, was pickled onion monster munch. There's no relevance to funding. It's just a fact. And people very rarely get that answer correct, but I'll have a look on the chat in a bit. But in relation to Billy Joel, I see Renata shouting yes, so there you go. Okay, Renata apparently is the winner. Well done.
Joe, it was Dave actually. I kept a close eye on it, and Dave, yeah, success to Dave. I have to say that was the one that I think came in on the crisp question first.
Thank you very much. So the Billy Joel question is related to fundraising, in that not many people realise that at the beginning of his career, Billy Joel was actually a charity fundraiser. Not many people know this, and it's not in the public domain in general, but you can actually tell, because he wrote a sort of famous ode, which people think is a love song, but it's actually about stewardship between charities and funders, and actually is quite applicable to really going back and talking to funders at a time of, you know, when people need uplifts and support. So you may not realise that that's what it is, but if we go on to the next slide, if you look at the lyrics to Tell Her About It by Billy Joel, you know, it is clearly about stewardship, and it is vital that you do tell the funder what you need, tell as much as you can. And I appreciate that. Again, we come back to the question, well, aren't funders putting a lot of burden on applicants? But again, ultimately, we have to demonstrate that what we are doing is valid, and we have a finite amount of money. Now, and the final thing, which I won't go through all this because we want to do this quickly, but the final bit of the verse, you tell her now and you won't go wrong before it gets too late. And I mean, this is genuinely vital. We have organisations that will approach us as a funder and say, look, you know, we're almost going to sort of go to the wall tomorrow. And actually, as the fund, certainly within our team, we're actually very flexible. We can actually act relatively quickly. But if you're coming to the fund and saying that, you know, it's vital that we get an uplift tomorrow, we can't do that. So talk to your funder at the earliest opportunity, so you can start having those conversations. And yeah, I won't go anymore. That's 15 minutes exactly, I think. So I've stuck to my time. The only thing I will say is genuinely, if you're ever doing a workshop on stewardship for any new fundraiser, just use that song, tell them to memorize it. And yeah, you can't go wrong. So I'll pass back to Josie now.
Thanks, Joe. Definitely those questions got the most response out of anything I think I've ever seen on our webinars. So thank you for those. Yeah, the question is, what was the prize?
The prize is a £10 donation to their charity per correct answer.
Okay. Well, Dave will be on to you. I don't think anyone else got tell her about it. So that one, Billy Joel came up the most. Anyway, moving on to questions. So yeah, quite a few questions have come in. I think there were some kind of process questions specifically targeted at sort of Joe and the National Lottery Community Fund, which I'm going to leave because I think we can kind of easily probably address those in a follow-up email. Couple that I did want to kind of, however, flag. So I think the first one is just about Francesca